Welcome to video number 18 for Fablehaven in front of a live audience of gentlemen today. No girls. Maybe one will show up. We shall see. Okay, so remember they needed to talk in private about whether or not what they were going to do with Mariel. Kendra and Seth returned to the path. Kendra dumped her bartering items in the wheelbarrow. She spoke in a soft whisper. I don't think we have any other choice. I don't like how nice she's being, said Seth. It's almost scarier than before. I think she's really anxious to get out. I know, but I think we're just as anxious to restore Grandma and maybe find Grandpa. She's a liar, Seth cautioned. I don't think we can count on any of her promises. Probably not. We should expect her to attack us as soon as she's free. If not, great. But I brought salt, whatever good that will do. Don't forget, we'll have Grandma to help us handle her, Kendra said. Grandma might not know anything about fighting witches. I'm sure she's learned a trick or two. Let's try to ask her. Seth held up the hen. Kendra stroked her head gently. Grandma Sorensen, Kendra said, Ruth, I need you to listen to me. If you can hear me, we need you to answer. This is very important. The hen appeared to be listening. Should we untie the last knot to have Mariel Taggart restore you? The head bobbed. Was that a yes? The head bobbed again. Can you give us a no? The hen did not respond. Grandma? Ruth? Can you shake your head so we can be sure you hear us? Again, the chicken made no acknowledgement. Maybe it took all she had to answer your first question, Seth speculated. It did not seem like she nodded, Kendra said, and I don't know what else we can do. Freeing the witch has a high price to pay, but it's worse than having no hope of finding Grandpa and keeping Grandma trapped forever as a chicken. We should free her. Kendra paused, scrutinizing her feelings. Was this really their only option? It seemed to be. Let's go back, she agreed. They returned to the doorway of the shack. We want you to restore Grandma, Kendra said. You will voluntarily sunder my last knot, the final impediment to my independence, if I restore your grandmother to her human form. Yes, how do we do it? Just say, of my own free will, I sever this knot, and then blow on it. You should probably find something for your grandmother to wear. She will not have any clothes on. Kendra ran to the wheelbarrow and returned with the bathrobe and a pair of slippers. Mariel stood on the doorway, clutching the rope. Lay your grandmother at my threshold, she instructed. I want to blow on the knot, Seth said. Sure, Kendra answered. You let Grandma out of the bag. Kendra squatted and pulled the mouth of the bag wide open. I'm going to let her in. Mariel held the rope out to Seth. The chicken looked up, ruffling her feathers and flapping her wings. Kendra tried to steady her, disgusted by the feel of slender bones moving beneath her hands. Of my own free will, I sever this knot, Seth said. As Goldilocks squawked noisily, he blew, and the knot unraveled. Mariel extended both hands over the flustered hen and began softly chanting indecipherable words. The air wavered. Kendra squeezed the squirming hen. At first, it felt like bubbles were shooting through the flesh of the bird. Then, the delicate bones began to churn. It's a vocabulary word, isn't it? Yes, churning. Kendra dropped Goldilocks and stepped back. Kendra saw everything as if through funhouse lenses. Mariel appeared distorted, first stretching broad, then tall. Seth became an hourglass with a wide head, a tiny waist, and clownish feet. Rubbing her eyes failed to cure her warped vision. When she looked down, the ground curved away in all directions. She leaned and swung her arms to maintain her balance. The funhouse, Mariel began to ripple, as did the startling image of Goldilocks, shedding feathers as she expanded into a person. The scene grew dim as if clouds had blocked the sun, and a dark aura gathered around Muriel and Grandma. The darkness expanded, momentarily obscuring everything, and then Grandma stood before them, completely naked. Kendra put the bathrobe over her shoulders. From inside the shack came a sound like the rushing of a terrible wind. The ground rumbled. "Get down," Grandma said, pulling Kendra to the ground. Seth also fell flat. A furious gale blasted the walls of the shack into shrapnel. The roof rocketed beyond the treetops, a geyser of wooden confetti. The stump split down the center. Fragments of timber and ivy whistled in all directions, clattering against the trunks of trees and slashing through the undergrowth. Kendra raised her head. Dressed in rags, Muriel gaped in wonder. Chips of wood continued to fall like hail, along with fluttering bits of ivy. Muriel grinned, displaying deformed teeth and inflamed gums. She began to chuckle, tears brimming in her eyes. She flung her wrinkled arms wide. "Emancipation!" she cried. "Justice! At last!" Grandma Sorensen rose to her feet. She was shorter and stouter than Muriel, with hair the color of cinnamon and sugar. "You must vacate this property immediately." Muriel glowered at Grandma, the joy in her gaze eclipsed by spite. A tear escaped and slid down a crease to her chin. "This is my thanks for unbinding your curse? You have your reward for the services you rendered. You have emerged from confinement. Eviction from this preserve is the consequence of prior indiscretions. My debts have been paid, and you are not the caretaker. My authority is the same as my husband's. In his absence, I am indeed the caretaker. I invite you to leave and never return." Muriel turned and began tromping away. "Where I go is my own business." She did not look back. "Not on my preserve." "Your preserve, is it? I object to your claims of ownership." Muriel still had not looked back. Grandma started walking after her, an old woman in a bathrobe, trailing an old woman dressed in rags. "New crimes will entail new punishments," Grandma warned. "You might be surprised who administers the penalties. Don't provoke new enmity. Depart in peace." Grandma quickened her pace and caught hold of Muriel by the upper arm. Muriel twisted free, turning to face Grandma. "Tread lightly, Ruth. I will oblige you if you seek trouble here and now in front of the little ones. This is the wrong moment to cling to antiquated protocol. Things have changed. Whoa. Things have changed more than you realize. I suggest you depart before I regain authority here." Seth ran toward them. Grandma took a step back. Seth flung a handful of salt at the witch. It had no effect. Muriel pointed at him. "Your recompense is coming, my bold little whelp. I have a long memory." "Your actions require retribution," Grandma warned. Muriel was striding away again. "You speak to deaf ears." "You said you'd tell us how to find our grandpa," Kendra called. Muriel laughed without looking back. "Hold your tongues, children," Grandma said. "Muriel, I have commanded you to depart. Your defiance is an act of war. You issue evictions in order to build a case for wrongdoing and thereby justify retaliation." Muriel said, "I do not fear a feud with you." Grandma turned away from Muriel. "Kendra, come here." Grandma pulled Seth to her in a tight hug. When Kendra drew near, she embraced her as well. "I am sorry for misleading you children. I should not have guided you to Muriel. I did not realize this was her final knot." "What do you mean?" Kendra said. "You heard us talking." Grandma smiled sadly. "As a chicken, thinking clearly becomes an exhausting challenge. My mind was in a haze. To interact with you like a person, even for a moment, required tremendous concentration." Seth nodded toward Muriel. "Should we stop her? I bet the three of us could take her." "If we attack, she will be able to defend herself with magic," Grandma said. "We will forfeit the protection afforded by the foundational covenants of the treaty." "Have we messed things up?" Seth asked. "Setting her free, I mean?" "Things were already dismal," Grandma said. "Having her on the loose certainly complicates the situation. Whether my assistance can compensate for her interference remains to be seen. Grandma looked flushed. She fanned her face. Your grandfather left us in quite a predicament. It wasn't his fault, Seth said. Grandma bent over, placing her hands on her knees. Kendra steadied her. I'm all right, Kendra, just a little woozy. She stood up experimentally. Tell me what happened. I know undesirable beings entered the house and took Stan. They took Lena too, and I think they turned Dale into a statue, Kendra reported. We found him in the yard. Grandma nodded. As caretaker, Stan is a valuable trophy. Same with the fallen nymph. By contrast, Dale seemed unimpressive and was left behind. Any clue who took them? We found some footprints near Dale, Seth said. Did they lead you anywhere? No, Seth said. Have you any idea where Grandpa and Lena are being held? No. Muriel probably knows, Grandma said. She has an alliance with the imps. Speaking of Muriel, Kendra said, where did she go? They all looked around. Muriel was no longer in sight. Grandma frowned. She must have special means of hiding or traveling. No matter, we aren't equipped to deal with her now. What do we do? Seth asked. Our first order of business is to find your grandpa. Learning his location should dictate how best to proceed. How do we do that? Grandma sighed. Our nearest option would be Nero. Who? Kendra said. A cliff troll. He has a seeing stone. If we can successfully bargain with him, he should be able to reveal Stan's location. Do you know him well? Seth asked. Never met him. Your grandfather had dealings with him once. It will be dangerous, but at present, he's probably our best alternative. We should hurry. I'll tell you more on the way. Chapter 14, Trolling for Grandpa. Have you ever heard people conversing while you're falling asleep? Grandma said. The words reach you from a distance and you can barely glimpse the meaning. That happened to me in a motel once when we were on a trip, Kendra said. Mom and Dad were talking. I fell asleep and their conversation turned into a dream. Then, to some degree, you can grasp my state of mind as a chicken. You say it is June. My last clear memories are from February, when the spell was enacted. For the first couple of days, I remained fairly alert. Over time, I lapsed into a twilight consciousness, incapable of rational thought, unable to interpret my surroundings as a human would. Weird, Seth said. I recognized you kids when you arrived, but it was through a clouded lens. My mind did not reawaken until you let those creatures in through the window. The shock jolted me out of my stupor. It was a struggle to cling to my elevated consciousness. I cannot describe the concentration it required to write that message to you. My mind wanted to slip away, relax. I wanted to eat the delicious kernels, not arrange them into bizarre patterns. They traveled along a wide dirt road. Rather than head back toward the house, they had continued on the trail beyond the ivy shack, venturing deeper into the forest. The trail had eventually forked and then intersected the road they were currently following. The sun blazed overhead. The air was heavy and humid, and the forest remained unnaturally silent all around them. Kendra and Seth had brought a pair of jeans, but they turned out to be from Grandma's skinnier days and were not even close to fitting. The tennis shoes belonged to Grandpa and were several sizes too big, so Grandma now wore a bathing suit under her robe, and her feet remained in slippers. Grandma raised her hands, staring as she opened and closed them. Strange to have proper fingers again, she murmured. How did you become a chicken in the first place? Seth asked. Pride made me careless, Grandma said. A sobering reminder that none of us are immune to the dangers here, even when we imagine we have the upper hand. Let's save the details for another time. Why didn't Grandpa change you back? Kendra asked. Grandpa's eyebrows shot up, probably because I kept laying eggs for his breakfast. I like to think that if he had taken me to Muriel in the first place, I could have prevented all this nonsense from happening. But I suppose he was searching for an alternate cure for my condition. Besides asking Muriel, Seth said. Exactly. Then why did we have Muriel cure me? I'm sure he knew your parents would return soon, leaving insufficient time to discover another remedy. You had no idea Seth had become a mutant walrus and been restored by Muriel, Kendra said. I missed all that, Grandma said. As a hen, most details escaped me. When I urged you to take me to Muriel, I assumed she still had 2 knots remaining. Only when I looked up and observed the single knot did I begin to fathom the actual predicament. By then it was too late. Incidentally, how did you end up as a walrus? Seth and Kendra related the particulars about turning the fairy into an imp and the subsequent retribution. Grandma listened, asking a few clarifying questions. As the path curved around a tall thicket, a covered bridge came into view up ahead. Spanning a ravine, the bridge was composed of dark wood. Although aged and weathered, it appeared to be in reasonably good repair. Our destination draws near, Grandma said. Beyond the bridge, Kendra asked. Down in the ravine. Grandma stopped, studying the foliage off to either side of the road. I am suspicious of the stillness in these woods. A great tension rests upon Fablehaven today. She resumed walking. Because of Grandpa? Seth asked. Yes, and your newfound enmity with the fairies. But I worry there may be something more. I am anxious to speak with Nero. Will he help us? Kendra asked. He would rather harm us. Trolls can be violent and unpredictable. I would not solicit information from him if our situation were less dire. What's the plan? Seth asked. Our only chance is clever bargaining. Cliff trolls are cunning and ruthless, but their avarice can be a weakness. Avarice? Seth asked. Greed. Cliff trolls are miserly creatures, treasure hoarders, cunning negotiators. They relish the thrill of besting an opponent. Whatever agreement we reach, Nero will have to feel like the undisputed victor. I only hope we can determine something he values that we are willing to part with. What if we can't? Kendra said. We must. If we fail to reach an agreement, Nero will not let us leave unscathed. They arrived at the brink of the ravine. Kendra placed a hand against the bridge and leaned forward to look down. It was surprisingly deep. Tenacious vegetation clung to the steep walls. A narrow stream trickled along the bottom. How do we get down there? Carefully, Grandma said, taking a seat at the edge of the precipice. Rolling over onto her stomach, she started backing down the slope, feet first, looking ridiculous in her robe and slippers. The incline was not completely vertical, but most of the descent was quite steep. If we fall, we'll tumble all the way to the bottom, Kendra observed. A sensible reason not to fall, Grandma agreed, moving carefully downward. Come along, it looks worse than it is. Just find solid handholds and take it one step at a time. Seth followed Grandma, and then Kendra started down, desperately hugging the side of the ravine, taking tentative steps, hunting blindly for the next place to rest her foot. But Grandma was right. Once she got going, the climb was less difficult than it appeared. There were many handholds, including scrawny bushes with well-anchored stems. After proceeding gingerly at first, she grew in confidence and increased the speed of her descent. When Kendra reached the bottom, Seth was squatting near a cluster of blossoms at the edge of the stream. Grandma Sorensen stood nearby. Took you long enough, said Seth. I was being careful. I've never seen somebody move 1 inch per hour before. No time for bickering, Grandma said. Kendra did just fine, Seth. We need to hurry along. The end for today.